and she wanted him. But Joseph was not that kind of man. So he did not welcome her advances. He rebuffed her. So she was bitter. And she told a big fib on him. Well, Potiphar finds out what happened. First of all, he probably knew that it was his wife, but he had to save face, threw Joseph in jail. And Joseph ends up being connected to a couple of people from the palace. Now, let me stop there because I've shared a lot with you. Let's go back to Genesis 37. What I find so interesting about this is that you would think because God called this family was going to have it together. That is not necessarily the case. It is often that families who have this burden of service can sometimes be the most troubled families. And this is why when we think about this process that I'm encouraging us to consider, is we can't think that these families that will be entrusted to our care, that these are going to be perfect families that have no challenges, have no problems, have no issues. It could be that they have those issues, and God is going to look to you to help disciple them in spite of those issues. Okay? So it is important to me that we are very sensitive, because we often have trouble with people who make mistakes. We do. You don't believe me? Just make a mistake in your own family. Some of your family will never let you live it down. Some won't forgive you. Some will stop talking to you. Some will withdraw from you. We have a problem. We have a problem in dealing with people who make mistakes. Now, what's interesting is that you act like you haven't never made no mistake. And what if God treated you like you treating your family member who made a mistake? I've seen this in the church my whole life. Y'all know I was practically born on the pew. People make a mistake all the way from the pew to the preacher. And we just lose our mind. You know, on one day, Jesus was dealing with behavior like this. They had caught a woman in adultery. And Jesus was talking to him, and Jesus, in so many words, said, "He who was without sin, let him cast the what? The first stone." And you can probably hear those rocks dropping. Why? Because they knew that they really didn't have the right to stone someone, knowing my own situation. So I'm saying this to say that in this environment, we want to be an environment that's rich with forgiveness, that's rich with grace, that's rich with mercy. People should not dread coming to the church when they become pregnant. People should not dread coming to the church when they impregnate. People should not dread coming to the church when they divorce. People should not dread coming to the church when, you know, the husband living in an apartment and the wife staying at the house with the kids. But we have created such a difficult environment. People would rather stay home than come and be judged. Now, what are you saying? I'm just simply saying this family is messed up. And yet this is the family that God is going to ultimately deliver, that will be the seed of the 12 tribes of Israel. So what does that say about God and how God thinks about us and our behavior? And I'm suggesting to us that we need to have some of that divine thinking and how we deal with each other. Now, look, I'm going to tell you, you can't do good for people expecting them to do good for you. Right. One of the lessons I learned in my ministry was that one of my members did something really bad. And when you're the preacher, in most Black congregations, most things start with you. And that's just because of your relationship and your connection with the people. Most people call you. I've gotten calls before the coroner got the call to come and see about somebody who died. So, you know, you never know what's going to happen at the end of that phone call. Well, this individual had done something bad, and it was against somebody in the church. Now, I'm thinking to myself, now, what am I going to do? Now, I probably could have hung him out to dry. But I've always tried to be the kind of person that I'm going to treat you how I want you to treat me. So I decided to unfold the thing within our existing elders. And the three of us said, we're going to handle this. We met with the people, straightened it out. A couple years later, the tide turns at the church, and I'm thinking, okay, am I gonna, kind of be with this ministry? And what I found interesting was that the main one that was aggravating me the most was the one I helped. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, if I had handled that differently, would he or she be so bold in talking that talk? So what you have to do is you have to do the right thing regardless of how people gonna treat you. Because at the end of the day, I don't really want you to hook me up anyway. You know who I want to hook me up? I want to put that in God's hands. All these years later, things have developed as they've developed. I'm just telling you, in this setting, we've created an environment where we're all over the board with how we treat people. Now, I've been to churches where people come who are on the pedophiles list, and they treat them like they got the plague. I've seen people come who, you know how like people divorce and then they get married to somebody else and then they go to another congregation and people don't know that first family? Y'all do know we do that, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm just talking about the imperfect nature of just working with people. So as we're thinking about, okay, God, we want you to bring in 40 new families, and we want to be ready to receive them. I want you to be thinking about what that really means, because they're not going to be perfect. And we will have to be skilled enough to work through the challenges they have and the challenges on the horizon. People can be 37, so cruel. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Now, I got two brothers. My brother Daryl and my brother Gamaliel. I love my brothers. We're not as close as I want to be, but prayerfully, as we get mature, we'll be closer. I could never imagine them selling me into slavery. And yet, that's what we read in our story. When I read stuff like this in the Bible, I don't have the kind of disposition that, wow, those are really some bad guys. I've kind of grown to the point now where I ask myself, could I do something like that? Could I dislike somebody so much that I sell them into slavery, figuratively, today? Genesis 39, Joseph has a special calling on his life. People will tell you about Joseph and his many abilities. He was a dream interpreter. I think his greatest ability was an administrative ability. I do think that today we need to try to bring to the table more people who are talented in administration. Not all church leaders are administrators. You have to accept the fact that, yeah, you might be a leader, but I'm a terrible administrator. So I'd written an article for the Christian Chronicle. Sometimes when we write these articles, we get responses from the public. So I wrote my last article was on the ministerial crisis. I actually have a new series that I'm doing on church revitalization, but on this last article, and somebody wrote me, and they, just basically, took me to task because the way that I write, I come from more of an urban perspective. In the Black church, the preacher sits at the table, and the preacher, for the most part, does a lot of guiding and directing. Whereas amongst our Caucasian brethren, you have the elders, so to speak, and they kind of are entrusted. Now, I think in a healthy model, there's balance between both. And that ought to be the way that we look at it. But what I found interesting is the things that he was telling me the elders should be doing. None of those things involve caring for the people. Lynn Anderson, in a book called They Smell Like Sheep, says, if you're an elder and most of your time is not spent caring for the sheep, then you're not really an elder. And I firmly believe that. If when we get together, if our conversation is not around shepherding and caring for and taking care of the people, then why are we really meeting? Joseph was somebody's administrator. He was given that responsibility going all the way back to his dad. One of the things that I'm sure Jacob Israel saw is that this guy has administrative ability. It reminds me, I'm watching this new Lakers series on Hulu, and the Bus family. Boy, those siblings, when Jeannie really got the mantle, I mean, those brothers had a difficult time with it. Jeannie Buss is the one who got the juice. I'm sure it's the same dynamic in Jacob's family. So he was a leader in his family. He was a leader in Potiphar's house. And then you look up and he's standing second in command in Egypt. See, part of that is, as a leader, you have to be able to empower the people that have the skill that the organization needs. That is a good administrator. It is a sad day when you're a lousy administrator and you won't empower the people on your team who can do what needs to be done. All right. I'm still reviewing. Genesis 40. Joseph is an interpreter. There are a couple of words that are used in the Bible to describe these otherworldly practices. We talked last week about mediums. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about witches. I want to be careful in that some of this is not wholly evil. There are some aspects to the way this thing works where the people of God did employ some of these practices to an extent. So Joseph was a dream interpreter. Joseph had the ability to be told something and then he would explain it. All right, this was something that came from God. So what got him out of jail is he was allowed to interpret the dream of who? Pharaoh. Pharaoh was so happy, Joseph ends up being the second in command all over the land. So he's sitting up there one day, and in walk them boys who sold him into slavery. In they walk. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. So they do all this roundabout stuff, and he talks about the dad and everything, and he sends them back to basically bring the family. They come up with some scheme where, they put a cup into their belongings, and that's what's used to, trump up all this anxiety. This would have been a diviner's cup. This was not just some old cup that he drank out of, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this was a special cup. So basically what happens is Joseph's father, Israel, his younger brother that he didn't know he even had, and all the rest of the brothers and the dad, they're all saved. And they're saved because of Joseph, his life, where he is, and it's just like it was in the dream. Joseph is here, and everybody is bowing down. And what's interesting is that when you go to Genesis 45, the word used for weep is one of them hard, I can't breathe cries. And I don't know when the last time you really cried like that, when you really wept. But Joseph was almost hysterical with emotion. I don't know if he didn't think his family was going to want him or what. But from his perspective, they were all reunited. And I love how Joseph does not exhibit bitterness. Immature people are bitter people. It takes a mature person to have been wronged and to still be sweet like honey and nectar. Now, I've tried to teach this to couples that I've worked with over the years. They're not trying to hear it. You know why? Because we don't think that the erring spouse deserves forgiveness. God forbid that he treats us like we treat each other. Joseph exhibits so much maturity and stability. God put him through everything that he went through so that he could be in a position to save his family from the famine. Looking back on everything, this is how God providentially worked out this whole thing. And Joseph is rich and mature enough to welcome in his family. And from there, they grow and they grow and they grow. And then, of course, Moses comes on the scene, and then we have a whole nother story that begins. So what questions do you have about this story? I hope I've done it justice. What questions or observations do you have? Yes, sir, Brother Gabo.
Sibling rivalry for their child's gifting.
Right.
They do that and see how it impacted the story. That's very good for us to parent the church to be aware of that, so that we don't scar our children or we mar the growth of the church because our families are unhealthy, because there's unhealthy dynamics going on within the family related to the way the father and the mother treat the children.
Right. Right. You know, the other day, you know, I'm studying on this stuff, Hawk, and I thought that my parents sent me and my brother to public school. I didn't know that my younger brother went to Normandy Christian School. I don't know how I didn't know it, but in my mind, he and I both went to public school. My sister's always gone to private school. My sister probably had dyslexia. I remember my sister, she's always played basketball. She was on scholarship, and Thurica would drive hour and a half, 2 hours to school, hour and a half, 2 hours back, get in, get a bath, get something to eat. She almost went to sleep at the table every night studying. Now, I like to study, but I wasn't balling like that. So for her, okay. My brother, now I'm gonna tell you how this sibling stuff worked. Y'all know I felt kind of bad that I was the only one they sent to public school. Now I'm 52 years old. And I had to tell myself, that is so silly. So what are you saying? I'm just simply saying, you know, however you fit in this story, don't necessarily make it about Joseph. Try to make it about your own life and those challenges that you wrestle with and that you deal with. I mean, how silly would that be for me to have an attitude with my parents because they didn't send me to private school? Sister Laura, you had something? What's a valid attitude?
Oh, it's the way you felt. Private school versus public school.
Right,
Felt some kind of way,
right.
you know, yeah, I would have felt that way too, but Martha over here, we have this argument all the time because they think I'm my mother's favorite. My mother doesn't.
They think
They think
you're the favorite.
that I'm the favorite.
Okay.
And it's not true.
That's not true.
It's not.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have this battle all the time about it. It's just a different relationship.
Right.
Family issues.
Right. Sister Ward?
Okay, I was in a family of 8 kids. I was the number 6 child. And the sisters 2 above me was a straight A student, you know, and she was just like this different child. So my mother always kind of favored her, and you know, she always demanded this and demanded this, and she got it. There was a younger sister, younger than me, and this was at this time my mother was, I guess she was tired because she was the last child.
Right.
So whatever she wanted, all she had to do was holler, and my mother would say, "Give that to that baby." She would get whatever I had, or my
Right.
boys, or whatever. So I was just like stuck in the middle. So I'm the 6th child. First 5 kids, my dad sent to college. When he got to me, I don't have any more money.
Oh.
And so I kind of felt like I was in the wrong position in that family.
Right.
In that family dynamic, but you know, it just told me I have to just do for myself.
That's right.
You know, I really suffered from the smart one to the baby being right there in the middle.
You started something, Brother Adamson.
Yeah, I see. I see I did. But all right, last one. Yes, sir.
And one of the things that one of his sons said is that he told each one of his children separately that you're my favorite child. And one of them overheard him saying it to one of the others. He said, but Dad, I thought you said I was your favorite child. He said, you are. He said, but you said I was. He said, you are. And he said that he told each one of his children that they were his favorite child because he wanted no sibling rivalry between his kids. And so I immediately adopted that and told that same thing to my own children. And I thought that was a really cool way to be.
Right. Thank you for that. So your homework is to answer these questions. All right. And this means on a separate piece of paper, or if you want to write it on the back, and I'm wrapping things up. Brother Garrett, raise your hand, please. Ray, that's who's going to help you with the singing this morning. All right. What is dysfunction? If you need to look up some of this, you can. But I think everybody knows what dysfunction is. What are some examples of dysfunction? You're welcome to take some of the examples from the story. I really want you to give some examples from your life. And it's, you know, you aren't going to turn this in or anything. This is just for us to kind of bring out the lesson. Can God use dysfunctional families? Why does God use dysfunctional families? Explain God's providential will. Now, let me help you with that last one. When you look at God's will, today I'm going to talk a little bit about God's permissive will, and I'm just going to mention it in passing, in that God permits some things to happen. All right. Technically, at the end of the day, God is over everything. So that responsibility goes to him. But in terms of understanding will, when you read the Bible, there are some things that God permits, God allows this and that to happen. When you look at what's called God's providential will, you can think about that in terms of how God orders the world, and it's happening from Genesis 1 up through the end of the book of Revelations. That's God's providential will. Hurricane Ian, potentially, weather phenomenon, some of the other things that we experience could be a part of what's called God's providential will, in that in the way God looked at the world and allowed the world to happen, there would be some parts of the world where the sky would be beautiful. There are some parts of the world where the sky would be dark. There are some parts of the world where the rain would be light and just enough to break the heat of the sun. Then there are other parts in the world where that rain is coming down, and it's coming down really, really bad. There are some parts of the world where there's a light breeze. There's some parts of the world where it's a violent wind storm. God has a way of balancing and ordering our world. And oftentimes when we try to make sense of things, these things point back to God's providential will and how God arranges the world as we understand and see it. Now, it is possible at times, and we do see this in the Bible, where the people of God appeal to God, and it looks as if God is pivoting. And rather than do this, God can do that. This is why prayer is so important. And yet, in and of itself, there are some things that are just going to happen. So how would you understand that in relationship to the story of Joseph and his family? And how might that work in relation to my own family, to my own life? When I moved to LA in 1983, one of the first couple days I was here, I was dropped off a Century in Slauson. I didn't know where I was. I was just going to get a hamburger. In walked all these guys dressed in blue and had blue jeans. I didn't know anything about the Crips. They ended up beating me up and taking my food. You know, I wasn't murdered, but I did get a pretty good beat down. And I remember my mother was just hysterical, and my dad was kind of like, well, how do they look? I mean, that's not what he said, but, you know, he was just, you know, and that was my introduction to LA. Now, what I could do is I could take that unfortunate experience and I could allow that thing to color the rest of my life. But now I can talk about it. Hey, yeah, I've been through some challenging things. I've been through a beat down. I mean, it, you know, it kind of is what it is. What beat downs have you received? Have you allowed that beat down to be what colors and defines the rest of your life? I'm not the only one who's had a beat down by some gang members, and I won't be the last. But what I can do is learn from it and use that valuable lesson in terms of how I deal with and minister to people from that particular socioeconomic background. So I want you to be deeper than Sunday school deep. Sunday school deep is you get something put out to you and you know, give me the answer like that. I want your answers to be reflective. So when we come back and when we look at this, I want our discussion to mirror some reflection. Here's why that's important. I'm closing. Because when we welcome these families into our lives, we want to be able to pull from examples like Joseph and to use that as we do ministry. And that's what this is all about, helping us get ready for ministry. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you so much for learning. We thank you so much for your word and its ability to speak to our heart and lives. Help us, dear God, as we read the word. Help us to be open to those things that you would have us learn. May we not be afraid and cowardly. May we be bold, looking for the truth, particularly if that truth can help us in some meaningful ways. Be with all of our families that are present today. May we all be readying our lives for the harvest that's on the way. In the name of Christ, we do pray. Amen.